Picture the night of February 24th, 2022. It is 3:55 in the morning in Kenya. The city is dark. Every television anchor on Earth was about to tell you the same story. Russia invaded Ukraine. That became the headline the whole world accepted. But here is what almost nobody told you. 3 days before the first tank crossed that border, economists inside the Kremlin had run the numbers one final time. They had calculated how long Russia could survive a total financial war. They had looked at their balance sheet, their reserves, their commodity flows, and they decided the ledger gave them one window, one narrow closing window. The bombs did not start that war. The accounting did. We think wars begin with generals and grievances. They do not. They begin in spreadsheets, in treasury vaults, in the cold arithmetic of debt and resource dependency. Every major war in modern history has a financial fingerprint that predates the first shot by years, sometimes by decades. The armies are just the final argument. The real conversation happened in the counting house, long before the cannons fired. And the war that is quietly assembling itself right now, the one historians will eventually call the Third World War, is no different. It has a ledger. It has a balance sheet. And that balance sheet is already bleeding. To understand where we are going, you have to understand where the world stood at its absolute peak. Cast your mind back to the summer of 1944. The war in Europe was grinding toward its end. American soldiers were pushing through France. The United States held roughly 2/3 of all the monetary gold on the entire planet. 2/3. Think about the scale of that. In a mountain bunker in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 730 delegates from 44 nations sat down at wooden tables and agreed to build the entire post-war financial world around one currency, the American dollar. The world's financial architecture was essentially an American franchise. For 25 years, the system held. Europe rebuilt on American credit. Japan industrialized on American investment. The global economy expanded at a pace that had never been seen in human history. In 1960, U.S. gross domestic product represented nearly 40% of all global output. American companies dominated every major industry. American banks held the keys to every major economy. The dollar was not just a currency. It was oxygen. And for a generation that had just survived the Great Depression and the Second World War, that oxygen felt like a miracle. Gold in Fort Knox, manufacturing in Detroit. The sun never set on the American balance sheet, but beneath the gleaming surface, a crack was forming, quiet, invisible, lethal. The crack had a name, Vietnam. By 1968, the United States was spending $30 billion a year on a war it was not winning. President Lyndon Johnson had simultaneously launched a domestic spending program called the Great Society, pouring billions more into social programs without raising taxes to match. The federal government was writing checks its gold reserves could no longer cover. Foreign governments, led by France under Charles de Gaulle, started noticing. They started demanding their dollars be converted back into gold, exactly as the Bretton Woods Agreement had promised. By 1971, it held barely 8,000 tons. The money was gone. The gold was gone. On the night of August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon sat in front of a television camera and calmly told the world that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar to gold. No warning. He simply closed the gold window. Overnight, Every currency on earth became a piece of paper backed by nothing but trust. Nixon called it a temporary measure. It was never reversed. A slow-motion bankruptcy dressed in the language of monetary reform. What happened next was pure genius and pure poison at the same time. The Nixon administration needed a new anchor for the dollar. It needed something to replace gold. Something every nation on earth needed desperately. Something scarce, strategic, and perfectly suited to give Washington permanent leverage over the global economy. They chose oil. Between 1973 and 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh and cut a deal with Saudi Arabia that would define the next 50 years of geopolitics. The agreement was elegant in its brutality. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, Washington would provide military protection to the Saudi royal family and guarantee their grip on power. Every other OPEC nation followed. The petrodollar was born. Now every country on earth that needed oil, which meant every country on earth, had to first acquire dollars. The dollar had a new anchor, but the anchor was not stored in a vault. It was buried under the Arabian desert, controlled by a monarchy, and dependent on a security guarantee America would have to keep paying for with blood and treasure. This is where the addiction began. The petrodollar gave the United States an extraordinary privilege. Because the world always needed dollars to buy oil, America could print money and export inflation. It could run trade deficits that would have bankrupted any other nation. It could borrow at rates other countries could only dream of. This privilege has a name in economics. It is called exorbitant privilege, a phrase coined, bitterly, by a French finance minister, and like every privilege built on dependency rather than production, it created a monster. The monster's name was debt. In 1971, the U.S. national debt stood at $400 billion. By 1981, it had reached $1 trillion. By 2000, it was $5.6 trillion. By 2008, it crossed $10 trillion. By 2020, it surged past $27 trillion during the pandemic. And by the middle of 2025, the United States owes more than $36 trillion to its creditors. Let that number sink in. $36 trillion. If you stacked $100 bills to represent that debt, the stack would reach the moon and back twice. That is more than the United States spends on its entire military budget. The world's most powerful nation is now paying more to its creditors than to its soldiers. Now meet the true antagonist of this story. Not a general, not a dictator, not a missile silo. The antagonist is a mechanism called the U.S. Treasury bond market. Every year, the United States issues hundreds of billions of dollars in Treasury bonds. Foreign governments, central banks, and sovereign wealth funds buy these bonds, lending Washington money in exchange for interest payments and the promise of repayment. This system only works as long as those creditors trust the dollar. As long as they believe the United States will honor its obligations. As long as they see no better alternative. For decades, there was no better alternative. But two countries decided to build one, China and Russia. By 2009, China held over $900 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. It was the single largest foreign creditor America had ever had. China was also deeply unhappy about it. Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao said publicly in March 2009 that he was, quote, a little bit worried about the safety of China's American investments. That same year, Russia proposed replacing the dollar as the world's reserve currency at a meeting of the newly formed BRICS group, Brazil. But the seed had been planted, and Moscow was already drawing a very different kind of balance sheet. Russia's economic strategy after 2014 was methodical and deliberate. Between 2014 and 2021, Russia dumped nearly all of its U.S. Treasury holdings, cutting its position from $160 billion to almost zero. It replaced those dollars with gold. In 2014, Russia held roughly 1,000 tons of gold in its central bank reserves. By 2021, it held over 2,300 tons, making it the fifth largest gold holder on the planet. At the same time, Russia built a domestic payment system to replace SWIFT, the Western-controlled financial messaging network. It built alternative clearinghouses for energy trades. It signed bilateral currency agreements with China, allowing oil and gas to be priced in yuan instead of dollars. Russia was building a financial bunker because it knew what was coming. Now go back to February 24th, 2022, the day the tanks rolled. Within 72 hours of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States and European Union executed the most aggressive financial weapon ever deployed against a major power. They froze approximately $300 billion of Russia's central bank, reserves held in Western financial institutions. $300 billion, just gone, not seized, not spent, frozen, held hostage. In the history of modern international finance, no sovereign nation's reserves had ever been frozen on this scale. This was not a sanction. This was a declaration of financial war, and every government on earth noticed. Sit with what that moment meant to the rest of the world. In Beijing, in Riyadh, in New Delhi, in Ankara, finance ministers and central bank governors pulled their advisors into private rooms. They all asked the same question. If this can happen to Russia, can it happen to us? The answer was terrifyingly simple. Yes. Any nation that held its reserves in dollars, euros, or pounds and found itself in Washington's crosshairs could wake up one morning to find its national savings simply gone. Sovereignty is solvency, and the dollar, they suddenly understood, was not just a currency. It was a leash. The response was immediate and seismic. Saudi Arabia, America's most critical petrodollar partner, began quiet negotiations with China to accept yuan as payment for oil. By the spring of 2023, the first yuan-denominated oil trades between Saudi Arabia and China cleared through the Shanghai Exchange. The arrangement that Kissinger had engineered in 1974, the one that had underpinned the dollar's global dominance for 50 years, was cracking. Iraq announced it would settle some oil trades in yuan. Brazil and China agreed to trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. India began paying for Russian oil in rupees and dirhams. France's Total Energies settled its first liquefied natural gas trade in yuan in March 2023. The petrodollar, grain by grain, was dissolving. Here is what the smoking gun actually looks like. It is not a missile launch order or a military ultimatum. It is a document filed quietly with the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. In the summer of 2023, it is the official expansion of BRICS. The group invited Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, Argentina, and Egypt to join its membership. Combined, the expanded BRICS Plus bloc represented more than 40% of global oil production and nearly half the world's population. Combined GDP was approaching parity with the G7 nations for the first time in modern history, and every single conversation in every single BRICS summit had one underlying agenda item. How do we stop using the dollar? How do we build a settlement system that Washington cannot freeze, cannot sanction, and cannot weaponize? The foreclosure notice on the petrodollar era had been filed. It was just waiting for a judge to sign it. But here is the cold, terrifying logic of the ledger. When a reserve currency loses its status, the nation that issued it faces consequences that are almost impossible to overstate. The United States currently funds roughly 70% of its annual federal deficit by issuing Treasury bonds to foreign buyers. If those foreign buyers stop buying, the Federal Reserve must either print the money itself, which triggers inflation, or interest rates must rise dramatically to attract new buyers. In 2022 and 2023, the Fed raised rates from near zero to 5.25% in the most aggressive tightening cycle since the 1980s. Mortgage rates doubled. Corporate debt loads buckled. Regional banks collapsed. First Republic Bank, with $212 billion in assets, failed in May 2023, the second largest bank failure in American history. Silicon Valley Bank collapsed weeks before that, taking $175 billion in deposits down with it. These were not random events. They were the first hemorrhages of a financial system bleeding out. Now understand the military logic that flows directly from this financial collapse. A nation drowning in debt, watching its currency's reserve status erode, seeing its creditors quietly building alternative systems. That nation faces a choice. It can manage the decline, negotiate a graceful transition, and accept a smaller role in the New World Order. Or it can use its remaining advantage, military superiority, to prevent that transition from happening at all. This is the precise calculation that has preceded every major conflict in modern history. Imperial Britain did not go to war in 1914 because of Franz Ferdinand. It went to war because Germany's industrial output had surpassed its own, and its financial empire was facing structural obsolescence. Japan did not attack Pearl Harbor in December 1941 out of ideology. Japan attacked because the United States had cut off its oil supply in July 1941, and Tokyo's war planners calculated they had 18 months of fuel remaining. They chose war over bankruptcy. The gold was gone. The credit was freezing. The alternatives were multiplying. This is the precise moment when empires make their most dangerous decisions. There is a number that should keep every person alive today awake at night. It is 1.7 billion. That is the combined active military personnel of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, 4 nations that have now signed formal military and economic cooperation agreements and have all publicly committed to operating outside the dollar system. Combined, they produce 35% of the world's steel, 40% of the world's wheat, and more than 55% of the world's rare earth minerals, the materials without which no modern weapon, electric vehicle, or computer chip can be built. The economic geography of the planet has shifted. The ledger has been rewritten, and the side that was rewriting it did not wait for permission. Meanwhile, the United States in 2025 spends $1.1 trillion every single year simply to pay interest on its own debt, not to build infrastructure, not to fund its military, not to invest in technology, simply to service the bill for money it already spent. By 2034, The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments will exceed $1.6 trillion annually, consuming nearly a quarter of all federal revenue. The wealthiest nation in human history is slowly becoming the most indebted entity in human history, and it is paying that debt to the very nations it considers its adversaries. China still holds approximately $800 billion in U.S. treasuries. Every interest payment Washington makes goes, in part, to Beijing. Think about that. America is borrowing money at 5% interest and sending a portion of that interest directly to the country it identifies as its primary strategic competitor. The night WW3 begins will look, on the surface, like every other night. Missiles, maybe. Cyberattacks, certainly. Power grids failing, communication systems going dark. But the people who understand how history really moves will tell you something different. They will tell you the war started years earlier. It started the night Nixon closed the gold window and unmoored every currency on earth. It started the morning Kissinger landed in Riyadh with a deal no democracy had voted on. It started the day Russia's $300 billion disappeared into a Western vault, and every sovereign government on earth recalculated its exposure to the dollar. The physical war, the one with the missiles and the blackouts and the emergency broadcasts, that is just the final audit. The ledger had been failing for decades. The bombs are just the bankruptcy proceedings.